I mean, I was a raised bed gardener for about 20 years before I built my first stone bed. And now that's all I want to do. All I want to do is just design new stone beds with new stones and new heights and new shapes.
That is Scott Wilson. You may know him from his YouTube channel, Gardener Scott, which has over 460,000 subscribers. He is a master gardener, an educator, and the author of the new book, Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening. I read the book, and it is a comprehensive step-by-step guide to planning, building, and maintaining raised beds, with a focus on soil health, sustainable practices, and maximizing yields in various spaces. And since Scott's approach aligns with my mission to provide evidence-based gardening techniques to you, I thought that he would make the perfect guest for this month's special series on raised bed gardens. So, today on Just Grow Something, Scott shares his extensive knowledge on raised bed gardening, including the importance of creating your own soil mix and the benefits of using raised beds. We talk about the significance of compost, cost-effective ways to build raised beds, and the process of becoming a master gardener. We also touch on planning and planting strategies, as well as the potential for growing a variety of plants beyond vegetables. Let's dig in.
And what started as a small backyard garden 20 years ago turned into a lifelong passion for growing food. Now, as a market farmer and horticulturist, I want to help you do the same. On this podcast, I am your friend in the garden, teaching evidence-based techniques to help you grow your favorites and build confidence in your own garden space. So grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. You garden in Colorado, it's zone 5B, right?
Yes.
And your soil there is interesting. Let's
terrible. You can say it's just flat out terrible.
So is that what led you to decide that, raised beds might be the way to go?
Yeah, that was a big defining factor. I had dabbled in gardening for a while, and a little over 20 years ago I became a master gardener and really didn't know much about raised beds until then, and realized that all the struggles I had in the terrible Colorado soil could be solved by just putting in raised beds and creating a good soil mix. And it definitely changed the way I garden.
What kind of struggles are we talking about in terms of the in-ground?
Well, and so I recommend to anyone that asks to do a soil test when you're first starting a garden, just to establish a baseline. And my native soil has less than 1% organic matter, almost immeasurable.
Soil testing. Sound familiar? Testing the amount of organic matter in the soil is done through a university extension soil test. This isn't something that your off-the-shelf kit can measure. That is focusing mostly on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, along with the soil pH. This is something that you need to send away to have tested. Now, the ideal level of organic matter for soil is 5%. So less than 1% meant Scott was gardening in essentially just dirt, or in his case, sand.
And it is primarily sand, and it is actually a compacted sand. So for me to grow in it in any expected success rate requires a lot of amending over a lot of years, and even then it's marginal. And so the gardeners I know in my area who grow in the ground are always struggling because they just don't add enough organic matter. And in a raised bed, I started right off with a good percentage of organic matter, and since then I've learned about designing my own soils and creating my own soils and using different soils for different types of plants. And I can do all of that in my raised beds.
So in terms of somebody who is wanting to create their own soil in their raised bed, you said you've experimented and you've learned a lot over the years about what the components should be and how you can modify that based on what it is that you're growing. Let's start with what would be considered like just a basic way for somebody to be able to fill a brand new raised bed. What would you recommend in terms of the composition of that and what materials they should use?
So the basic soil should actually be soil. And Mel Bartholomew, in his book about square foot gardening, And Mel's mix it's really a soil-less mix. It doesn't have the natural native mineral-based soil. And so a lot of gardeners think that a potting mix is all you need, or you put together perlite and peat moss and that's all you need. That mineral component really is important. And I don't like to spend a lot of money, and I don't encourage people to spend a lot of money. So they can use their native soil, which has minerals, which has some modicum of nutrients in it, and then add organic matter to that. A good soil that you've probably seen the wheel that tells that a soil is 25% air and 25% water and 45% of that mineral soil, and you only need 5% of it being organic matter. Now that's by mass, that's not by volume. So it really ends up being generally about 20 to 30% by volume of organic matter. And compost is what everybody recommends, and I agree with that because compost already has nutrients that are available for the plants. A good compost will actually continue to decompose a little bit and release even more nutrients for plants. And so it's as simple as that, just taking your own native soil and mix in a lot of compost and you can get started. Now, in my book, I talk about that if you don't have compost, if you don't want to buy compost, you're not familiar with the source of your compost, then any organic matter will actually work. So I use dried grass clippings, I use crushed leaves, I use whatever organic matter I have.
Remember what we talked about last week about how to fill a raised garden bed? Here we have another gardening expert outside of the university system talking about using leaves and all kinds of other types of organic matter to fill our beds. We really do not need to be relying strictly on compost for this.
And so when I said, I have learned to build my own soils and I experiment a little bit with that, it's because if I'm filling a bed in fall, it's probably going to have a higher percentage of dried leaves, crushed leaves. If I'm filling a bed in late spring or summer, it's probably going to have a higher percentage of dried grass clippings or even fresh grass clippings that are mixed into it. And so I have dozens of beds, and every bed has a different soil composition based on what materials were available when I filled it.
And I don't think we can overlook the fact that your native soil is going to have a lot of the microbes that are native to your area that are going to be able to help inoculate that compost, especially if it's sort of brand new finished compost in that bed. When it comes to the building of a raised bed, now we've done it 6 ways to Sunday. It's been leftover materials. It's been cinder block. It's been, here recently, I've got a company that I work with whose beds that I love, and it's like ship them to me, and it's US steel that I can all put together, which is fantastic. But one of the things that gardeners over the years have been told not to do is to use treated lumber. And as an OSU alumni, I love the fact that Oregon State University came out with a study that said, not really. Can you talk about that study a little bit and kind of ease everybody's minds?
Absolutely. In fact, I was actually part of that study. So I worked with the Oregon State University team. And like you said, I've got concrete block beds, I've got metal beds, I've got wood beds. And some of the team had actually watched some of my videos on YouTube and saw that some of my beds were made with pressure-treated wood. Some of my beds were untreated wood. Some of my beds had the lower half untreated and the upper half treated. I was trying all kinds of different combinations so that I could, at least within my garden, point out to everybody that the plants will do just fine regardless of how you're using it. And I actually took soil samples of all of my beds and sent them to Oregon State University as part of that study. And what they found out was you can use pressure-treated wood all day long and not worry about it. There is a minimal amount of copper leaching because the pressure treatments in the woods that are available to us now are all copper-based. but so minimal that it had no impact on the plants. And it's nothing to worry about anymore. 30 years ago, when the pressure treated woods were using an arsenic compound, then yes, that was something to be concerned with. And not so much because of the plants, but because if you are working with wood that has arsenic in it and you're not wearing gloves, it could be a problem. But even with the copper azole and all the other copper-based chemicals that they're using now, you can do it with your bare hands. I use gloves just because I don't want splinters when I'm doing the beds, but pressure treated wood is perfectly fine in the home garden.
So, when people have come and they have a concern about, okay, how much is it going to cost me to do this? What is the least expensive way for me to do this? Do you have recommendations for them?
Well, the least expensive way is exactly what you said. I've got beds that I constructed with reclaimed wood that cost nothing, literally nothing, because the wood was free, had a bunch of nails just lying around, and I nailed the boards together and built a bed. So that by far is the most cost-effective way to make a bed. You can also make a bed, and it doesn't have to be wood. You can stack stones. You can use whatever materials you have. A raised bed is simply just an elevated area that we are growing plants in. And so the cheapest by far and very little work is not even to have edging around it. If you do like a hugelkultur mound, that's a raised bed, and you can actually grow in a mound of amended soil. So that's one end of the spectrum where you can have raised beds without spending any money whatsoever. If you want to go into the mode of building the rectangular box, which one of the huge advantages to that is when you plan your garden, you can, in the cold of winter, set your little grid paper and figure out where you're going to put your plants and how many are going to fit in the bed. And that works perfectly with a rectangular box that's 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. And that's what you go to Home Depot and Lowe's and buy 8-foot long boards. You can make a bed like that. So next up on that spectrum is buying untreated wood. That will cost you the least amount of money. But as you pointed out, depending on your climate, you might have to replace it in 5 or 6 years. I'm at the 6-year point for my untreated beds, but it's very dry here in Colorado. And so I've got at least 3 more, maybe 4 more years in those beds without any problem whatsoever. Probably about 25 to 30% more in cost is pressure treated wood. And you can expect that to probably last twice as long. And then as you continue moving up the spectrum, you can get into concrete blocks or bricks, or I've made some beds this last year that I just absolutely love with flagstone. Now, flagstone is not cheap when you buy it in the quantity that you need to build a raised bed, but it's going to last forever. And I will never need to replace any of those components. So there's for the most part, a pretty direct correlation to the cost and how long the bed is going to last.
One of the things that I found in your book, there was a picture of a spiral herb garden that was just these stones that spiral. And now I am determined to build one of those here. I thought that was just the coolest design. And it just goes to show, it doesn't have to be linear thinking. It doesn't have to be, we're going to make it 4 by 8 and every single one is going to be 4 by 8 and there's going to be exactly 18 inches in between each path or 36 inches or whatever it is. You can be as linear and as organized and, point to point as you want to be, or you can be as whimsical as you want to be in your garden with raised beds. They don't have to be one particular type.
Okay, coming up, Scott and I talk about working with new compost, soil management, and the process of becoming a master gardener, which was something I was completely unfamiliar with, but I get asked about a lot. Everything that Gardener Scott is talking about in this episode is true of raised beds, and my favorite raised planters come from Planter Box Direct. You get your choice of colors, sizes, dimensions, even tiered planters and planters on legs to fit every garden space. They're simple to put together, but they're designed to last a lifetime, and they are my go-to when designing any new space around my gardens. Through October 15th, you can save 20% and get free shipping on these USA-made steel beds at planterboxdirect.com. Use code JustGrow20 in honor of this special raised bed series, and you'll have your own new planter beds in time to build them and fill them this fall, so they'll be ready to plant in the spring. Planterboxdirect.com with code JustGrow20. The link is in the show notes.
When you talk about compost, using compost for raised beds, one of the things that I have encountered with folks who have no way to really create their own compost, or at least not in the volume that they prefer, in terms of having to purchase compost to bring it in. One of the things that I have encountered is when people are building new raised beds and they get this idea of, oh, it's spring, it's time for me to build my beds, and I'm going to bring in this truckload of compost, and then they're going to fill the bed in its entirety with this brand new compost. And then they find out that their stuff is not growing. Mm-hmm. And, I see the frustration because they don't understand why that is. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So compost is organic matter that is in various stages of decomposition. And depending on where you get your compost from, it might actually be sterile. And a lot of the major manufacturers will sterilize the mix so that it stops decomposing. Well, it's the life in our soil and it's the life in our compost that makes the nutrients available to the plants. And so plants don't grow in a sterile environment. It can be the most amazing compost in the world, but if you don't have that microbial activity and that fungal activity within the soil, the plant is going to starve. It literally can't access all of those nutrients. And so, yeah, by all means, get the compost by the truckload. But what I recommend is you do that in fall, because you put the compost in your beds in fall. Now you have all of the autumn months and the winter months and the early spring months for that soil life to populate that bed and make all those nutrients available to your plants.
I love it when somebody else preaches this besides me. That way they can hear it from somebody else. So, talk to me about becoming a master gardener, because I have a lot of people ask me about this, and I am not a master gardener. I have a degree in horticulture from Oregon State, but I've never gone through, and I've gone to master gardener meetings and I've done presentations and had them out here, but I've never actually gone through the sort of course curriculum that goes along with this. Talk to me a little bit about that process, because I've had people ask me about what it takes.
Sure. And I became a Colorado master gardener a little more than 20 years ago. And the process has changed mildly, and each state might have its own minor modifications. But the basic process is that there is a university in every state that oversees the extension service. And the extension office is the one that oversees the Master Gardener program. And so when you become a Master Gardener, you are actually doing it under the auspices of some state university. So here in Colorado, it's Colorado State University that oversees the program. So when I went through, and these were in the days long before the computer and the internet and YouTube even, it was actually instructors from Colorado State University in the horticultural department that were doing most of the teaching. And the exposure to gardening is quite broad. And so the way I typically explain it to people is it's a week's long program, and it's an all-day class. So it might be Tuesdays or Thursdays. I think we went on Thursdays. And so in the morning for 3 hours, you get nonstop education on vegetable gardening. And then in the afternoon, you get 3 hours of nonstop instruction on fruit gardening. And then the next week you come back and you might get 3 hours in the morning on soil composition. And then in the afternoon after lunch, you get 3 hours on compost and mulch. And so that's the way the program tends to be laid out, is a very broad education without particular focus on any one area. And then after a couple months of classes, and so depending on where you're going, it might be 8 or 12 weeks of these little snippets. I think biology might have been one where like the morning was biology and the afternoon was botany. So that was the closest we came to a full day of the same topic. But you're not an expert on anything. And you finish and you have to take tests, of course, along the way. And when you are done, you're still not a master gardener. So that class is offered usually to the green industry. And so you have a lot of landscaping companies, for instance, that might send their people to those classes. To become a master gardener, you need to go to the next level, which is volunteering in the Master Gardener program for a period of months. And that's where you really begin that expertise phase. Here in Colorado Springs, where I'm from, and in most areas, there's a help desk or there's some operation where the master gardeners answer questions. Well, the master gardeners that are answering those questions are the master gardeners that just finished the training for the most part. So when they're asked a question, they might not know the answer, and often they don't know the answer. But what they've been taught as part of the Master Gardener program is how to find the answer and to look in the fact sheets that the Extension Service provides so that they can answer about insects or flowers or soil or compost. And that's really how you become a master gardener. You have to complete that volunteer phase before you get the certification of master gardener. And then you have to carry that on. If you want to maintain that certification, you have to continue taking some classes and you have to continue volunteering over a period of time.
That is fascinating. I had no idea that Cass County Master Gardeners, when they have their, their call-in hour every week, that those are the brand new people who are answering those questions and they're looking it up. That's fascinating. But it's a long process. I mean, it's some work. It's not something that you can just, okay, I'm just going to decide to do this. You really need to have a commitment, especially to maintain that certification. So you continue to have to do continuing education every year in order to sort of meet those qualifications to maintain your certificate?
Yeah, basically, it depends on the respective master gardener programs. So there's variety, throughout the country, and Canada as well also has similar programs. And so there's a key difference too, because when you become a certified master gardener, if you choose to continue to be certified, you don't have to know everything. Master gardeners tend to focus, and so most of the master gardeners I know might be an expert on irises, or they might be an expert on roses, or they might be an expert on compost. There are very few like me who just love learning and love gardening and try to learn everything possible about gardening. And then you might reach a point like I did where I kind of outgrew the Master Gardener program. And the things that I was being taught were not new. I knew much more than that. So while I'm a master gardener, I'm no longer a certified master gardener because I stopped doing the volunteer hours and the continuing education.
I think you're doing enough education on your own. I don't think you have to worry about the hours being tracked. And that's interesting. I think, sometimes, especially as somebody who is predominantly a vegetable gardener, I'm just like dipping my toe into messing with flowers because this is 18 years of growing vegetables for the public. And so my concern has always been production level. And forget if it looked pretty, forget if there was flowers out there, unless it was a native pollinator garden, that was fine. I'm just now sort of dipping my toe into roses and, some other things. But I think I always tend, when somebody says gardener, I automatically go to vegetables. So it's
Yeah.
interesting that you're like, oh no, there's the master gardeners, a lot of them, it's just about the flowers. And I guess I have to remember that when people want to come do a tour, when the master gardeners want to come do a tour and they want to see what we're doing out here, they've done the flowers, they haven't done the vegetables.
Coming up, Scott and I talk about crop planting in raised beds versus in-ground beds, preventing fungal diseases, how watering requirements may change a little when you control the composition of the soil, and more. That's next.
You had mentioned, the ease of planning in raised beds. I am a planner through and through. The first course I released was a planning course. It wasn't the course that anybody wanted. It was the course that I wanted to give them because I am a planner. And I agree with you. Raised beds make it so easy to just sit down with a grid and be able to space everything out beautifully, plan your interplantings, plan your intercroppings. What I have found is that sometimes, I am very much about, hey, take advantage of all of the space you possibly can and make sure that you are pairing these plants together. I have a high, low, fast, slow kind of, method where that's how you pair everything together so they complement each other. But I think in raised beds, sometimes, now maybe not where you are because the humidity level is always so very low in most instances. I have found that because that soil level is just below the edge of the bed itself, that sometimes we worry a little bit more about some fungal diseases getting in there because there's less airflow, because it sort of gets trapped in there. Do you have recommendations for people about properly spacing your plants within the raised beds as they're planning versus maybe how they would do it in an in-ground bed?
Oh, sure. And I luckily don't have many issues because I am, like you said, very low humidity and very high wind. So most of my plants, I have the opposite problem. I have to worry about my beds drying out too quickly. But that's a very important thing to be aware of. And it does depend on the plant because there are some plants that like higher humidity. But if you live in an area with high humidity and fungal diseases as part of normal gardening, there's two big things that I usually recommend. The first being, of course, pruning and taking off usually lower leaves in tomatoes. That's the example that is so prevalent. So you can get the airflow across the ground so it does dry out a little bit more. And you don't have the likelihood of those fungal spores bouncing up onto the leaves of your tomato plants. So selective pruning can make a big difference. You can also get into trellising, where you get the plants away from the ground. Now, you can also do this in in-ground beds, but it's just so easy in raised beds where you can build a trellis that fits the bed perfectly. And then you grow up basically away from that high, humid environment that's all wet next to that mulch on top of a wet soil. And you let your plants breathe. You let the airflow go through the plants. So those two things I think are very important and are often overlooked by gardeners who have those kind of fungal issues. And then, of course, with the up and with the pruning, you throw in what you're talking about, which is ample spacing between the plants. And the problem I see most often is gardeners don't think about how big the plant is going to be right about the time that they're wanting to harvest that plant. And plants can get quite wide and they can spread quite a bit. So you look at the seed packet and it says spaced 12 inches apart. Well, yeah, that's fine for probably most of the life of that plant. But when that plant ends up being 24 inches wide and you got two of them together, you've got no airflow and you are creating the perfect environment for fungal diseases and for pests that like to hide amongst the branches as well. So the spacing does need to account for what the plant is going to look like later. And it's tough. I know, you know this as well. When the plants are young and they're so far apart, you feel like you just got to stick something in there, but you could be asking for a problem a few months down the road.
Yeah, my favorite trick is to put something in there that is going to be harvested well before that other plant gets to maturity. So, I mean, I'm infamous for, planting my tomato plants, but also having lettuce or spinach or something underneath it that's going to be totally done and out of the bed by the time the tomatoes need that airflow. I
That's a
think
great idea.
too, what would you say about the watering requirements for raised beds? Because I mean, again, in your area, it's super dry in most instances. It's very windy. Do you find that your raised beds dry out faster than what you would see in like an in-ground bed? And do you have to adjust your watering for that?
So in my area, my in-ground, remember I was talking about how terrible the soil was and how sandy it is, and the water drains right through it. And so my raised beds, because there is more organic matter in the beds, I actually do water less, not by much, but a little bit less because the soil is retaining more water because of that organic matter that's in it. And then one of the things, I didn't mention it when we were talking about filling a raised bed, but for my tall raised beds, the lower half is logs and branches and wood chips and leaves to fill up space, and I don't have to pay for them. I just fill up that space. But as those logs and branches and all that woody material begins to decay, it just sucks up the moisture. It's like putting in a little reservoir of water at the bottom of my beds. And so that also helps moderate the overall moisture level of the soil within my beds.
Okay, I want you to think about what Scott just said. If you got distracted there for a minute, go back and rewind and listen again. We talked last week about the layers in a raised bed when we're filling them, and about using those woody organic materials as one of the lower components, especially when you are filling a very deep bed. The concern sometimes is the breakdown of that material. Is it going to steal nitrogen from our plants during that breakdown process? And that might be true if we are creating beds like this in the spring and using a really large amount of carbon-based materials and then planting into the bed immediately. Then yes, the nitrogen that the plants need to grow might be taken preferentially by the microbes in the soil that need to use it to break down those carbon materials. But if we are building these beds in the fall and allowing the materials to settle in and break down over the winter, then using those woody materials in the bottom layers of the bed is not going to be a concern. And as you heard Scott just say, this woody mass is actually going to help the beds retain water as it decomposes. So we're getting organic matter, we're getting nutrients, and we're getting water retention, all positives.
So I always test my soil on a regular basis. I should do it daily, but I don't always do it daily because other things get in the way. But just simply sticking your finger in the soil to seeing how moist it is. And almost always here in Colorado, that top inch or 2 inches is dry because of the low humidity and because of the wind and because of the sun. But if you dig down 3 inches or 4 inches close to the root level, the soil might be perfectly moist. And so that's how I water, is based on if the plant is getting enough moisture where the roots are, and not so much if the top is dry or if the top is wet. Raised beds do tend to dry out faster than an in-ground bed, all other things being equal. But you can moderate that by making sure you have that extra organic matter.
Oh, I think that that's a huge, plus to just one of them to raised bed gardening is, again, that control over the soil composition and being able to make sure that you have that right amount of organic matter. And glad somebody else is preaching the less frequent, more thorough waterings. Get down there in that 4-inch mark to see whether or not they leave, they need that moisture. So I appreciate that viewpoint because, again, if you're controlling the soil, then you're controlling how much moisture retention there is.
As I mentioned in the intro, Scott has literally written the book on raised bed gardening. His recent release, Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening, is exactly what it sounds like. A down and dirty look at how to build raised beds, build good soil, and how to plan for growing in those beds.
I was super excited. I'm going to put that on the camera there to read this. Talk to me about why you decided that your book was going to be the guide to raised bed gardening. You mentioned that, when you got started, nobody was doing raised beds. There wasn't anything about it. Was that part of the reason behind writing this?
Well, so that was part of the reasoning. Yes, absolutely. And I do talk a little bit about that book But when I was contacted by Firefly Publishing and asked if I wanted to write a book, they actually proposed a few subjects, and I said I'd prefer to write something that I really think I'm an expert on, and that others think I'm an expert on as well. Those other books maybe will come at another time, but it really was what do I do the most of? What do I know the most about? And when I looked at my videos on YouTube, I have more videos about raised beds than any other video. My most popular video with over 4 million views, I think right now, is about filling a raised bed. So when I started looking at what people are watching on YouTube, it basically wrote itself from that point on, that yes, this book needs to be about raised beds. I get more questions about raised beds than anything else. And there's a lot of misconceptions, lack of awareness. And I think even for people who garden in raised beds, and that's one thing I wanted to put into the book, is even if you're a raised bed gardener, there's so much more you can do with raised beds that you might not even be aware of. Like you mentioned, the herb spiral. There's a lot out there that even experienced gardeners can still learn in raised bed gardening.
Yeah. So what else? What else do you think that people who have already been in raised beds or already, think they know everything about what it is to do in raised beds? What are the other things that you think would take them by surprise in terms of what they can do with their garden?
Well, you touched on it a little bit earlier when you said that get away from the linear thinking and start looking beyond what everybody else is doing. You look at all the videos on YouTube and everybody's growing in a 4-foot by 8-foot box. There are more and more people that are starting to use the metal raised bed kits that you alluded to. And beyond that, there isn't a lot out there. I've got a bed on how to make that cinder block raised bed, and it's one of the few on YouTube that shows how to do it because not many people are using cinder blocks. And last year when I did my stone raised beds, I'm not seeing a lot of other videos out there with people making stone raised beds. So that's it took me years. I mean, I was a raised bed gardener for about 20 years before I built my first stone bed. And now that's all I want to do. All I want to do is just design new stone beds with new stones and new heights and new shapes. And my stone bed I have 2 of them actually. I use them as kind of anchor points for an entry into my pollinator garden. They are circular. It's basically flagstone that has straight edges, but I built the beds big enough and high enough that there's a curve to them that just flows so nicely and it looks so nice. And I'm using them for annuals and perennials. The idea that vegetable gardening is how you garden when you have a raised bed, that's another thing that not enough gardeners are thinking about. You can grow some amazing plants in raised beds that are outside of the vegetable arena. And so just expanding your mind to encompass the potential beauty of a raised bed and the potential for new types of plants in raised beds. That's what I'm really hoping to encourage more gardeners to do.
Coming up, Scott digs deeper into the lessons he conveys for gardeners in his book and the question that every beginning gardener should be asking themselves before they begin.
Is there anything else that you wanted to point out about, your book, your YouTube channel, anything else that you think people ought to know?
Well, I wrote the book to be a primer for any gardener of any level, and particularly if you are a new gardener and you really aren't sure what to do. Well, my book talks about asking the most important questions about gardening. Why? And I think you have to answer the why question before you figure out where you're going to put your bed or what you're going to grow in your raised bed. So I ask a lot of those questions in the book, or encourage gardeners to ask themselves those kind of questions. But then I talk a lot about planning. I talk a lot about soil development. I talk about plant selection. I talk about the climate and how you match plants. I talk about watering. I talk about trellises. I talk about harvesting. I talk about the different seasons and what activities are best in what time of the year. And so it's really intended to be a gardening book that just happens to have a focus on raised beds.
I think you absolutely accomplished what you set out to do. Anybody who has listened to this podcast just listened to you say all of that and went, all of that sounds really familiar. So now they understand why I liked this book so much. So I appreciate you coming on. Anybody who wants to find the book, I'm going to absolutely link to that in the show notes. It's Gardener Scott on YouTube, and we will link to this. And I really appreciate you being here today.
Well, I loved being here with you. I can talk gardening all day long with anyone who wants to. And so I'm glad that today it was you.
I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Scott about raised bed gardening and just gardening in general. Like he said, anytime gardeners get together, we can talk for hours and hours about anything gardening related. I will link to Scott's YouTube channel and to the book in the show notes so you can check out all of his stuff yourself. I truly believe raised bed gardening is a fantastic way to grow, especially if you are dealing with soil that is maybe less than ideal, which, let's be honest, that's probably about 75% of us. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.
But there was a lot that didn't make it into the book. I had a lot more of the, this was me, this was my journey, these are the things I like. And they said, no, you can't have that in this book. We got to stick with the information that is appropriate. And so, that's all authors say the same thing,
Right.
Some of their best words are cut out, but that's all part of the process.
It's so difficult to be the writer and the editor. It's like there's a reason you're not supposed to be your own editor, because you would leave everything in.
Exactly.